There's a picture on my desk, a picture of my grandfather, the grandfather for whom I'm named. My brother is named for our other grandfather, Albert Hedden. This is the picture right here. It's one of the few pictures of my grandfather that I have. And in this picture, he is standing at the front of the Cool Springs Church, right in front of the pulpit. He's holding what clearly appears to be a Bible and seems to be teaching a Sunday school class, probably the Sunday school class that he taught there every Sunday for almost 50 years. And in this picture, right at the very top of the picture, you can see the bottom, just the bottom, of the picture that hung on the wall at the rear of the chancel. Not that anyone at Cool Springs ever called it a chancel. And if you're anywhere near my age, and certainly if you're a little older than I am, you know exactly what picture that was. And you would be right. It was the famous portrait of Jesus painted by an American artist named Warner Salmon in the year 1940. Actually, I was a little surprised to learn that the picture was painted that late. I would have guessed sometime earlier, perhaps even in the late 19th century. It is the most reproduced painting in history. And to this day, it hangs in countless American churches, and especially in Protestant churches. I can vividly remember sitting in the Cool Springs Church as a child, looking at that picture and praying for the sermon to end. So a couple of years ago, when Fred Barfoot, while visiting family in Memphis, ventured up to Cool Springs to determine whether it was in fact the center of the universe, as I had claimed, and took several pictures of the church and the cemetery that is full of Heddens and Garners. He took a picture, his sister took a picture of Fred standing in the pulpit. And when I saw that picture, I fully expected to see that picture over his head. And I was stunned and very pleasantly surprised to discover that it's no longer hanging there, that it has in fact been replaced by a plain wooden cross. I say I was pleasantly surprised because I think that picture has done more damage to American Christianity than almost anything else. Damage because how you imagine Jesus makes a lot of difference. Which is where I would like to begin today with you, by asking you how you imagine Jesus. I mean by that, when you close your eyes and think Jesus, who do you see? For example, is there anyone here who imagines Jesus to be bald? Probably not. Certainly not Salmon, who painted Jesus with long flowing locks, which to a kid growing up in the 1960s made Jesus look a whole lot like a hippie. But how about short? Does anybody imagine Jesus to have been short? You know, there's that famous story about Zacchaeus climbing a tree in order to see Jesus, because Luke tells us he was short. Now, Luke never says whether it was Zacchaeus or Jesus who was short. It could have been either. But nobody, absolutely nobody, ever imagines, reading that story, that it was Jesus who was short. But what about Jesus being physically disabled in some way? I think our immediate reaction to that is, of course not. Why? Because our Jesus is perfect. And that's not even to get into the whole question of ethnicity. Just how it was that the very tanned but clearly white Anglo-Saxon that Mr. Salmon painted somehow managed to be born in the Middle East. Though granted, all of the Old Testament heroes whose pictures I grew up with in Sunday school, all those pictures of King David and Samuel and Daniel, well, they were apparently all white Anglo-Saxons too. Which, when you think about it, is a problem. Last week in my sermon, I talked about one of the big challenges facing the church today. A challenge facing this and every other church in this rapidly changing world. The challenge of coming up with a suitable vocabulary with which to express the religious concerns of our own day. The problem being that so much of our traditional religious vocabulary is so rooted in the concerns of an earlier time, and often expressed in the language of that earlier time, a great deal of which comes from a translation of the Bible that no one under the age of 50 ever reads anymore, and only ever even hears at funerals and lessons and carols. Actually, you might hear it at Choral Evensong this coming Wednesday night. For example, last Sunday, our closing hymn was "O Zion, haste, thy mission high fulfilling," a hymn that was printed on an insert in your bulletin because that hymn is not in our hymnal. It was actually written here in Philadelphia in the year 1868. And for those of us who grew up on the King James Bible and who imbibed the great missionary spirit of late 19th and early 20th century American Protestantism, that hymn is a very powerful expression of faith, and one that may well be very meaningful to you. On the other hand, for anyone who didn't grow up in that period and who isn't used to that language, it just sounds old-fashioned, a period piece hopelessly out of sync with the present day. And that's the problem. Coming up with language to talk about our faith that is at one level timeless and can cover the concerns of many generations while at the same time pertinent to the issues of the present day. And doing that is no easy task. Now, of course, this is not a new problem. It's a problem that every generation has to contend with, though it is especially acute in our day because of the magnitude and rapidity of the changes that we have experienced in recent years. But it's always been an issue, and it was a huge problem for the early Christians, who had almost no vocabulary at all with which to talk about Jesus. In fact, it took several hundred years for the church to work out the vocabulary that it would use to talk about Jesus, about who he was and the significance of what he had done. And until that consensus was finally reached in what we call the Nicene Creed, there were all kinds of claims being made in the church about Jesus. Many of them claims that would eventually be deemed as having gone too far, and others that had not gone far enough. And that, I think, is exactly what our gospel lesson for today is all about. This famous story of the Transfiguration of the Lord. A story about how to imagine and talk about Jesus in a world where all kinds of claims are being made for him, and emphasizing here just exactly what it is that you must not lose sight of. If you've got it handy, I would ask you to look at the cover of your bulletin for today, because that picture was chosen for a reason. It's a picture of the central section of a mosaic that is in the apse of a chapel in St. Catherine's Monastery in the Sinai. Now, this mosaic dates from the year, we know it specifically, it dates from the year 565, which makes it one of the oldest artistic efforts to imagine Jesus in existence. It may not be the oldest such picture, but it's pretty close. And as you look at that picture, you can see what it's all about. It shows the transfigured Jesus in the center. There's obviously no question here as to who is Jesus, which is why his name is not on the icon, unlike all the others in the picture. To his left and to his right are Elijah and Moses. And below him, sprawled on the ground, are John, Peter, and James, the three disciples that Jesus has taken along with him up the mountain. This icon is completely crystal clear. The message that it conveys is obvious. Jesus stands at the center of all things, transfigured and exalted. Below him, and clearly deferring to him, are the twin pillars of the Old Testament, the great prophet and the great lawgiver, Elijah and Moses. And on the ground, utterly prostrate before him, are the three most prominent of the disciples, Peter, James, and John. There is an entire theology contained here. A theology built around the image of Jesus, transfigured and exalted, who is to be worshiped and adored. Which is why this image is found in a church, a monastery, that is built in an intentionally remote place, to which pilgrims would leave the everyday world to come and worship the exalted Lord in a place set apart for that purpose. Which is exactly what Mark was afraid was going to happen, and why this picture is not the story contained in Mark's gospel, at least not the whole story. You see, places like St. Catherine's Monastery and the whole theology that is represented by this famous iconic image are exactly what Peter was proposing that day to do in response to the vision of the beatified Jesus transfigured in the dazzling light. Peter wanted to build a shrine up there on the mountaintop to capture this moment forever, because this was the Jesus he had imagined. This was the Jesus he had longed for. This the Jesus that he had at last beheld in all his glory. This was Jesus, a heavenly Lord, exalted far above the humdrum world of everyday life down below. It's the Jesus that we very often imagine as well, and in whose honor we have built shrines like this church, shrines worthy of that transfigured Lord. But in the gospel, even before the words are out of Peter's mouth, that vision vanishes. And there's a voice from heaven, a voice which declares, "This is my Son, the beloved. Listen to him." And then as Jesus and the three disciples go back down the mountain, back down into that humdrum world of everyday life down below, Jesus commands them. He doesn't just tell them, he commands them not to tell anyone what they had seen. Because sure as the world, if you do, that's the Jesus that everyone is going to remember. Because that's the way they imagined him. Which is why the really important question still is not just how you imagine Jesus, but where you imagine Jesus. Because the great temptation for us is always to imagine Jesus in heaven. An exalted Jesus, a Jesus portrayed in dazzling light. But if that's our Jesus, then we've missed the most important part of this story. The fact that Jesus and his disciples came back down from the mountain, back down into the towns and villages of Galilee and Judea, back down into this world where Jesus had chosen to live. Not in heaven upon a throne, not even on a mountaintop in a beautiful shrine, but right here in the midst of human life. Right here, in fact, in the midst of us. Right out there at the corner of 21st and Walnut. And why would Jesus have chosen to be here and not there? Because this is where we are. And Jesus chose to be with us, which we'd know if we just listened to him. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, to whom be all glory and honor, now and forever.